Let's talk about defining comics for a bit. We've talked about the superheroes in a different presentation. Let's look at the term comics in its entirety. Once again, these borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. This is not an effort to make money or create a business. And I believe that all of this falls within the fair use doctrine. I should add that the vast majority of artwork used on these slides comes from Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud and his ideas about creating a definition of comics inform nearly everything in this presentation. We're going to start simple. My basic definition is using words and pictures to tell a story. And in a lot of ways, that's what comics do. But so do movies, for that matter. And technically, I suppose when my mother opens up a photo album from the 1940s and points to pictures of Uncle Johann or whomever, those pictures and her words form a story. Will Eisner, who was a famous comics creator and whose name is attached to awards for excellence in comics, called comics sequential art. And McCloud starts there with this idea of sequential art. There are, of course, objections. Animation could be sequential art. Sequential art could probably include music as well. And if you add the term visual to exclude music, you still have a situation where animation is there and comic books are not animated. There are a lot of things, but they're not animated. McCloud then goes on to use a big word, juxtaposition or juxtaposed. And he talks about this idea of juxtaposed sequential visual art. Juxtapose is to place two or more things side by side, often to illustrate a contrast. Sometimes things are juxtaposed, one is right side up, one is upside down, but when you put things in juxtaposition, you are using them to illustrate something about each one. Juxtaposition and space in comics act the same way that time does for film. So juxtaposed sequential visual art, does provide something, but the term art is kind of snooty, at least according to some people. It gives us this idea that we should all be walking around drinking tea with our pinky fingers extended. We can't please everyone. And so if you move from juxtaposed sequential art to juxtaposed static images, now things are getting arbitrary. And if you use juxtaposed static images in deliberate sequence, you have all of a sudden created a definition that includes words, because words are static images. That's what letters are. And when you place them in deliberate sequence, you have created words. So comics are not equal to words. Using something, words, does not create being something. So McCloud keeps going. McCloud keeps developing this definition, and it gets a little bit silly. Juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. I left out some of McCloud's discussion of whether sculpture placed in a sculpture garden could count as a comic or art or sequential art. So maybe the idea of using words and pictures to tell a story wasn't that far off. It is clean, it is simple, but McCloud comes up with, I think, an excellent definition. Juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response to the viewer. Produce an aesthetic response means we're going to admire the art. We are going to take a look at how that art adds to the reading of the words. And please remember that technically a comic doesn't have to have art, or excuse me, doesn't have to have words with it. It can be all art. But we're going to look for themes within the art, we're going to look for themes within the words, and we're just not going to go on forever. McLeod has an important caveat. But before we get to that, let's look at some of the terms that we've talked about here. Page, if you look at the visual, everything on the page is one whole page of the book. I can't really give you a better definition. A panel is one part of each page. If you look at the thing on screen, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, if I can count, panels. A frame is what goes around the panel. Then you can add this idea of the speech bubbles, which is what they're used when you're talking. And then the gutter is what is between each panel. There's a frame around the panel, and then there's a gutter between the panels. Each of those terms is important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because many of you, probably all of you, are going to do all of your reading, with the exception of the Black Hammer book, digitally. And when you're doing it digitally, and when you click the little option that allows you to just move everything forward on a click, I'm not sure that the feel for the whole page, looking at each and every panel and looking at the gutters and looking at the space and all of that, happens in the same way it does when you're looking at just the paper page instead of a digital page. So we're not going to spend tons of time on it, but I do think that these terms are important. Panel shapes vary considerably, and you will find that as you're reading through the digital books. The panel shapes will vary. They will be big, they will be small, they will be trapezoids, they will be ovals, they will be squares, they will be rectangles, they will be stars. It's like opening a box of Lucky Charms. They can be whatever shapes the marshmallows are. McLeod's definition excludes one important thing that perhaps some of us think of as a comic, and he contends, and I agree, it can't be a comic. There has to be one panel, more than one panel, excuse me. There has to be more than one panel. One thing is not a sequence. You have to have 2, 3, 4, 11, whatever. A single panel isn't a comic. If you don't have more than one panel, you can't get the concept of time. You don't get the sequence. McLeod has this panel, and if you look from left to right, where you have the man taking the photo, you have the young couple giggling and talking about the blinding flash, you have Uncle Henry's wife, Aunt Madge, or whoever, yelling at Uncle Henry. You have somebody telling mom to stop being a Karen or a Madge. You have two old guys in the corner snickering. All of those things cannot happen at the same time. He cannot yell smile. They cannot giggle. he cannot get scolded. They can not react to what they're hearing in the background at the same time. So McLeod points out that if you put in some panels and some gutters, you now get a comic and you get to show the time. Smile, the flash is blinding. Henry put the camera away, did not happen at the same instant. Smile came first, the blinding flash second, the scolding third. The old guys playing chess reacted. Now you have a comic. A single panel can't be a comic because it doesn't show you time. I've told you before and I'll keep repeating. I try to tell people, why bother? And I think for comics and I think for superheroes, the idea of time matters. One panel doesn't tell the whole story. Superheroes have an idea of sequence built into their stories. After one panel comes another, after one page comes another, after one book comes another, after one story arc comes another. We go from adventure to adventure. The last page is never the last page. Even if a publisher says the book is ending, there may be another edition 2 years later. There may be another miniseries a year later. There may be all sorts of things where the last page is never the last page because there's always another installment. And in the superhero genre, there's always another quest. And we'll pick up the quests in week 3. So the idea of spending a lot of time talking about the elements of the page, the idea of spending a lot of time talking about sequence and about time and about moving forward is important because the last page is never the last page. And we'll even talk about that in week 4, where we talk about some of the great superpowers, including the fact that some heroes never seem to die. I think I'll wrap this up here. I hope everybody's having a good week. If you have any questions, reach out via email. Uh, I'll be available during the Zoom office hours posted on the syllabus. And week 1, I'm sorry, but I won't be in the main office in Bede, in the physical office in Bede, excuse me. But email and the Zoom office hours should work. And then next week, I should be able to be back in Bede. Again, hope everyone has a good week, and we'll talk to you on the next video and for the videos next week.